You want one? You gonna look inside? Well, I just gave him the last one, I believe. But I made 15 copies, and they've all dispersed into the ether. So you can look around the room, the ether.
Is there a heater in the ether?
You never gone into the ether before?
Never gone to the ether.
What's ether?
Where's that heater at? I know Ethernet.
Ascending deeper
Deeper into the ether.
into the ether.
My mind is like a raging
entering the red door.
It's gonna be a good day, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, good week.
Yeah, good week.
Are there any ladies that go into the ether here?
Okay, I take it back. We're pretty much starting right away on the new copies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is one.
Yeah, 118, guys.
Give me some kind of handshake over there right now.
I will.
I got Anybody got that? You got it 118? No.
I got like 6.
All right, let's go, and we're on.
Nobody's got it. 118. You made copies?
Okay.
You made copies? Or
You made copies for this person.
We're gonna start on page 118. I made as many as I had paper for.
Okay. 118.
Right. So, page 118. So, a review of what we said last week. We started at Os Hey. We're bringing it home, finishing Basi Legani, and the final chapter here in the first mimer. There's 4 mimers, as we said. And we started with the concept that the Ruach Shtus, the spirit of folly, it really can only cover over on what we call the midos of the Nefesh Elokis, not its essence. What is the midos of the Nefesh Elokis? Like the, what's that?
Thought, speech,
Okay, but any even more than thought, speech, and action in truth. The midos is any sort of finite dimension or details of the godly soul. We said that the godly soul was like a rope of 613 strands, if you recall. And all those 613 strands are the aspects of the soul which invest into the body in all of its different parts. There's 613 body parts, so there's 613 strands of the soul. So when it comes to any of the contracted levels of the soul entering into any of the different particular body parts, so sinning in any one of those levels is called severing a strand or another strand. When you sever a strand or another strand, you don't feel as though you are blocked off from your basic life force because you still have a rope of 612 strands or 430 strands. In other words, you can go a long way messing up your connection with God and still thinking that you're just as connected as you were the day before, because as long as the rope is alive, you still feel somewhat Jewish. But if you're going to, God forbid, get into a situation, as we said before, where a test is going to come before you, when you realize that you're going to cut the whole rope with this test, suddenly you're going to feel that. All the tiny little strands, you're going to cut them and you're not going to feel them, right? And therefore you're just going to go on, sinning because you don't feel like it's really damaging your essential connection. But should you enter into a certain situation in life where you realize it's going to damage your essential connection, so suddenly you feel it very much that you're alive and you would run from it like you would running from death, right? As we said at length. The idea being is that that's a good sign, because it means there's something in the godly soul which is impervious to the folly and the fog of the Nefesh HaBahamis. At that level of essence, it dissipates and you feel your connection and you'd rather do anything than allow that connection to be severed. So the positive side of this is that you don't have to wait. Basically, the mimer is now coming to tell you very good news. You don't have to wait until that dreadful day comes when you realize you're standing face to face with severing your connection, because you can live in a state of what's called shtus to Kedusha, right? What's so funny?
I don't know. I'm trying to figure it out.
He's staring at me, trying to. I don't like staring at me.
All right, let's take it to shtus to Kedusha though.
Okay.
All right. So anyway, so the idea being is what's shtus to Kedusha. So we started explaining that the word shtus, it means folly, but the real meaning of the word just means to veer, to go off the central path, right? So usually when you go off the central path, you're going off the central path of intellect, which means you've become animalistic, and therefore you fogged your connection point and you're in trouble. But the truth is, you can also veer towards the positive. You can veer above intellect. And where do we see this? We talked about a whole story about Rav Yehuda Bar Ilai and Rav Shmuel, that they were dancing and juggling at a wedding. And we said that this looks like it's embarrassment to the status of a Talmud Chacham. In fact, he was rebuked by Rebbe Zera, who said, you're embarrassing us, you can't conduct yourself like this. In other words, you're acting crazy, looks like an animal. And when he died, not Rebbe Zera, but when Rav Shmuel died, a pillar of fire separated his grave and his whole existence and everything he represented from the rest of the world. And Rebbe Zera made this claim, Ahanile Shtuse Desaba. There's 3 different versions of what he said, but they all come down to the same thing. It helped him, this either shot of Hadas, it helped him his line of reasoning, so to speak, his shita, or it helped him his shtus. In other words, I realized that whatever he was doing over there, it made him greater than the rest of us. And what was he doing? He was acting crazy, basically, but crazy in Kedusha. And so we said, what was he really accessing? He was dealing with his soul at a level before it went down and contracted itself into the realm of intellect, into the realm of emotion, already into the realm of what we call midos, as we said before. When you're dealing with your soul at a level where it's irrational, you're dealing with the essential aspect of your soul before it contracts itself and puts on like a garment and a suit, which once it puts itself onto that garment and suit, it then becomes susceptible to the folly of klipa. Or as we said, the klipa's folly can only access and blur the lines once the godly soul has contracted itself. But if it's beyond the state of contraction, we have just mentioned a moment ago, it's impervious to the klipa, right? The klipa is basically, think about what the klipa is. The klipa is a lavush, it's a garment, right? And it basically, therefore, has a power to conceal and wrap itself around, like your body and your soul. Think of it like that. Your soul is susceptible to the animalistic tendencies because your soul goes straight inside of a body, and the body is like a foreign sort of enemy territory, and it wraps itself around every single power that the soul has, and therefore every soul power that you have is in a state of exile in a certain sense, unless it triumphs and makes its way out and sort of shows itself. But because it contracted itself, it became a finite power. The finite powers of the goof can totally surround it on all sides, and it's therefore susceptible to being covered, right? Because it's finite, because it's contracted. So if you're dealing with a level of your soul pre-investiture, so there's no grip that the animal or the bodily functions can have on it, because it doesn't lend itself to being contained and concealed. It's still in like its sort of wild, unlimited state. And that's because it's pre-rational, right? Rationality is the first of the 10 spheros, right? Chochmah, Bina, and Das is when it starts to come down, and it's the beginning of its enclosure. So beyond rationality is the soul's state where it's not really touchable. It can't really be accessed and covered over. Clear? So that being said, this state, strangely, looks very much like an animalistic state. That's why it's called shtus. They kind of share this name. Because what the animal has in common is that it blurs and blocks the rationality of your soul and makes you sort of disconnected. It covers over, blocks you from experiencing the rationality of your soul, and it's irrational. But it's irrational in an animalistic, negative way. So the godly sort of pre-rational state is also irrational. It's just irrational in a godly way. But it's also called shtus. It's also called animalistic in a sense. Because the animal represents sort of something that doesn't make sense. And so there's a pasuk, and this is what we left off on. It says, "Va'ani va'ar v'lo eida behemas ha'isa yimach." We said that this level of reaching the shtus of Kedusha, where the animal soul cannot grasp and have a blockage on yourself, it's called, like David HaMelech says, I was a fool, and I didn't know anything. I was like an animal with you. And therefore it goes on to say, "Va'ani tamidimach," but I was continually with you. In this state of folly, when you go into a pre-intellectual state, that's the only place that's really a safe space. Right? That's kind of a... Did not say that. That's the only safe space, right? Because it's untouchable to the grip of the animal soul. It's pre-investiture. You follow, Shmuel, what I'm saying?
Kind of. I mean, you're talking about the state of folly.
Of the Kedusha.
Say space.
The folly of Kedusha. Did you get that there's two levels of folly? Oh, that's unfortunate.
Well, we can continue. It's fine. I'll catch another time. I might know.
I think I saw you were saying Shema, so I can't take all the blame. Well, one more time. We're saying that shtus, the word shtus in Hebrew, it means folly, but really what it means is to veer. It means to turn, to lean. And it doesn't necessarily mean negativity. It can mean positive. You could lean below the line of reasoning. You could also lean above the line of reasoning. So basically the main concept you want to take out of this whole mimer is that there's something called shtus de Kedusha. It's called folly, but it's holy folly. And the advantage of it is it's sort of like the precious gift in our hands. Why? Because we were saying that nothing can touch your essential connection. It's just that usually you have to be put into like a life or death situation in order to access your essential connection. Someone has to come and say like, bow down to idols or I'm going to kill you. You say, kill me first, I'm a Jew. Like, yeah, it'll come out of you, right? That you like, there's something in you that will not bend because at a certain level of clarity, whatever that comes to you, that level of clarity comes in your life, it will dissipate the fog of the animal soul. You will suddenly feel your godly being, and you'd rather give your life than fall prey, right? But why wait until that day comes? In the meantime, you're severing all the little, strands of the rope of your godly soul, and you're weakening your connection on a daily basis. So he says there's a way to basically be in a state of accessing your real yid. And that is to deal with your soul on a level where it's before it even gets into the clutches of the animal soul, which is basically acting crazy as a Jew. Because if you're going to be irrational, accessing your irrational holiness, in other words, going way beyond what the rational Torah will tell you to do. In other words, to be careful about this, right? We're not like sort of going out of the lines of holiness is all about structure. So we're staying within the basic structure, but we're, for example, going and celebrating at a wedding, but we're dancing and juggling at the wedding. So it's like taking the simcha, which is already a mitzvah, to be mesameach chassan and kala, and doing it in an irrational way. So we're still within the lines. Kazun. But the way, the idea, what is the advantage of this, is that if you're sort of residing at that level, you're dealing with your soul before it contracts itself into rationality, and therefore once it's contracted into rationality, it can also be accessed by the fool of the animal and dragged down. If you sort of reside on a level where you're just like be pre-rational, your animal soul really can't touch that because your soul is like sort of shining at a state which is ungraspable from the animal.
So you're saying when you act irrational on a mitzvah in a controlled manner, or
right,
with proper guidance,
right?
That is shtus to Kedusha.
That's called shtus to Kedusha, exactly.
Okay.
And it's basically veering above the line. And if you have a look at basically our generation and certainly the room you're in, but this is a pathway in Judaism that is totally would be considered shtus to Kedusha upon anybody else's standards, any other generation's standards. Our generation, this yeshiva 100%. What is this yeshiva basically primarily based on? Taking a person who doesn't really know anything about Yiddishkeit, plucking him out of a college setting, right, or whatever it is, and all of a sudden trying to pretend like he's like a normal yeshiva bacher, sitting in yeshiva in a seder whole day long, and suddenly it works because everybody in his surrounding is like helping him put him on tefillin and telling him, even though you can't pronounce the words, go make an aliyah. Like this is shtus to Kedusha. This is not the way it worked in the previous generations. It's awesome. I mean, we're bringing our people back to life with yeshivas like this. This is the Rebbe's idea, yeshiva like this. It's crazy. It's just as crazy as sending a religious Jew who sits and learns Talmud all day and he's like a genius and a Rav, sending him into the middle of Pittsburgh and say, okay, make that place Jewish, right? A Chabad house. Crazy. There's no precedent for anything like that in the entire annals of Jewish history. It's a generation of shtus to Kedusha, right? And we take it for granted. We have to realize like how wild our whole pathway in Avodas Hashem is in these times, and sort of get into it, because the reason that it works is because it just short circuits the whole process of rationality. It's like you just go up in there you start to feel your soul feels good, you feel connected, you don't really know why, you don't really have to know why. By the end, by the end of the situation, you got your strand of 613 ropes going, your rope of 613 strands, very, very strong and powerful, you're connected again. Right? So this is sort of a, excuse me, are you Jewish generation? Are you right-handed or left-handed generation? Let's put on tefillin. You never met the guy in your life. He's running to his business. What is that? It's making the person who's putting the tefillin on him, and the person who's putting on tefillin be suddenly an irrational, godly state, right? And it grabs the soul. All of a sudden, the animal soul doesn't know what to do with it. It's impervious to the animal soul at that moment, at that level. Yeah.
So what I wanted to ask was, we have the animal soul and the godly soul, right? And they're functioning within normal parameters, but if we bypassed or deviated outside the lines of norm and realized this crazy area, don't they both reside now in that same place? Like, isn't the battle the same, just now on a crazier level?
No, because again, there's the grasp of the goof, of the body, right? Only has a grasp on something that's finite, right? So until the soul contracts itself into parts, into intellect, into emotion, into thought, into speech, into action, into its parts, right? Then the body just does not have any sway over that domain, right? Because the body is basically a kli, it's a vessel, and the vessel can only cover something which has edges, right? Like any vessel, you can only hold something if it has north, south, east, west, up and down. In other words, if it goes right forever, try find a cup that can hold a body of water that just goes right forever. Try and find a what do you call it? A riverbed that can hold a river that goes right forever. You can't. Everything in order to be contained, you have to be limited in all directions, and then something can surround you. That level of the soul, which is pre-investiture, pre-intellectual, it's pashut infinite. It's the aspect of the soul which doesn't really come into the body. It's your essential connection. And so therefore, it doesn't lend itself to being concealed, grabbed onto, or grasped. And therefore, there's no battle at that level. At this, it's really called like the Yechida of the neshama. At that level, there's something called Zeh Lu'umat Zeh. Let's put it in another capacity. There's something called Zeh Lu'umat Zeh As Elokim. Hashem made everything in such a way that it always has its built-in opposite, right? So if you have, for example, the love of Avram, you have the love of Yishmael, right? In other words, you have the love of godliness, you have the love of klipa, which conceals it, it masks it. You have the fear of Yitzchak, you have Esav, which is the sword. In other words, it has its opposite. So there's something at every stage. You also have in the realm of intellect, right? It says that Avram was the intellect, or Moshe was like the Indian of Ma, the bittul of the intellect. There's something called Re'uma. Even at the state of Chokhmah, there's a parallel of Chokhmah called see how bittul I am. Whatever, it's a whole sugya. The point is, everywhere you go, there's something that can oppose the godly force, except when you go into the Yechida. The Yechida does not have an opponent. Right? The only question is, how do you get there?
Would that be like the only place?
That's the only place. Yeah, that's why we're like, that's Chassidus, by the way. We talk about this. You have 4 levels of Torah plus the crown of the Torah. The 4 levels is Mikra, or they call it Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod, or they sometimes call it Mikra, Mishnah, Gemara, and Kabbalah, right? And then Chassidus. What is Chassidus doing up there? It's called the Yechida of the Torah. Why? Because when you learn this particular aspect of the Torah, it triggers your Yechida. It's an aspect which reminds you and makes you harmonize with that level of your soul, which does not have an opposing force. That's why we're so drunk on it. It's like we need this in order to stay at a level of shtus to Kedusha, be like wild for God, and we need that in order to stay alive at this time. Right?
Or bring Mashiach?
And bring Mashiach. Right?
I'm just curious, is it Tom? Like, the guy who's just like a very simple yid, who's just doing things like push it?
Mm-hmm.
Is he above reason? Is that how he's working?
I mean...
I don't know Tom. But
I mean, like the
simple
guy.
Well, if you can get this sort of Yechida to flow into your body. Look, no, forget the Yechida. Let's say like in days of yore, right? When the animals wasn't so strong against us, right? And you could combat it at every level without having to go berserk. Yes, you could be in a state of tamimis. In other words, it's called a bainani, right? Like you win over every power of your soul. The animal soul which is trying to surround you and bring you down to a level of taibas, etc., etc., etc. You win the battle every single time. And it's tamimis. Right? It's called Tomchei Tamimim. Right. We're here to support the Tamimim, to make ourselves in Tamimim. But the way that we do it came with Tomchei Tamimim, came also, what is Tomchei Tamimim? How do we get Tamim in our times? It's a yeshiva which put Chassidus into the Seder. That's the definition of Tomchei Tamimim. Which means that we came to the realization, the Rebbeim, the great ones, the sages, God, that in order for the Jewish people to stay Jewish, to stay in a state of Tamimis, that it's even shaykh for them to not be surrounded by their animal soul and confounded by it on all sides, they need a state of Hasidic thinking, which is basically pre-intellectual thinking. It accesses the very soul itself in order to stay in a state of Tamimis. The Alavai, we could stay in a state of Tamimis, but that's the only hope. It says if a drop will get into the prince's mouth, he'll live. You know the story. So anyway, that's what. You want to say something else?
So this level of Yechida, Hasidut, if we're able to access this on a personal level, it has huge ramifications, huge benefits. And then as a whole, also we can bring Mashiach. And without it, the only other option is to be in a situation where...
without it, you can go back in time and gain that powers and the strength of the generations that lived before us. There's no without it. This is what it is.
Well, what's that thing from Four Calls where you're in your life and you access this level?
What's that thing, what?
Like with the Purim story, that we were able to...
So again, if you can, any generation can access this light if they come to a state of life and death.
And that's the only other way.
That's the only other way. That's the only, or you could just be so strong that you don't need to access this light. You just master yourself, and frankly, those days are over. We're not that strong, right? So everyone's going to start falling prey because their soul powers are all, enclosed into negativity. You could see it in the world at large, basically. It's not just you, right? Look at Am Yisrael today. It's like just going on the basic way, trying to bring the Yidden back like in the normal course of affairs and just doing things we did before. It doesn't work, right? So there needed to be some kind of a radical shift, and the radical is the Rebbe. He started doing crazy things, and it worked. Because what he really did was jiggle the rope of our Yechida. And once you get there, it's like you're standing constantly in a state that your life is on the line, because you're like lechatchila going crazy for Yiddishkeit. And that's what, going back in the Maimer, that's what David HaMelech says, I'm continuously with you because I was like an animal with you. And he's not talking about the lower animal, he's talking about the higher, beyond das, beyond intellect animal. David HaMelech was a chassid, right? He stayed at this level continuously of being like wild for Hashem. Kolomar, which means to say, this that I stay at a level of a fool, but a shtus to Kedusha fool, and an animal, I'm continuously with you. At that level, I'm untouchable by the constraints of the animal soul. In order to reach to this level of Hashem's essence, who are they? The only way to get there is by surrendering your will at a level which is beyond comprehension. And it's a lot to ask of a person, right? There's no question that getting there is not easy, but Chassidus kind of gets you to get there. What you have to say. It's basically a nice of a nishma type of attitude, which nice of a nishma means, like when we received the Torah, we said, we'll do it before we understand it. You're standing in front of God. Why did they say we'll do it and then we'll understand? You know the story? Basically, God went around to all the nations and he said, do you want the Torah? Before he gave it to us, and they said, well, what's in it first? That's a reasonable thing to say. They were using their minds. And he said, well, if you're already asking me what's in it, it's not for you. First of all, he said to the Ishmael, he said, you can't rape. They said, no, we don't want it. He said to Esav, you can't murder. They said, no, thanks. He asked the Jewish people, do you want the Torah? And we said, yes, we want the Torah. And by the way, what does it say? Right? So why did we get to such a state where we were so foolish? That's called a fool, right? That's just to Kedusha right there. It's because we already saw the miracles. We already knew who God was. So we're like, well, if it's coming from you, yes, because we like you. And that's what Chassidus is, you see. Chassidus shows you God. And then you're like, okay, if it's like, if the mitzvahs have anything to do with that, then like, count me in. What is it? What are they? And that's why it's so important. It's Pashit brings you face to face with the Eibishter. It's literally Matan Torah when you learn Chassidus properly. So the idea being is that what it brings out of you is a willingness to do things that you don't understand. And to bittul your will at a level where it's beyond rationality. It's not only you don't understand, it's like it opposes the understanding. You're like, what? You want me to do that? In other words, I already had a bris, but you're saying it wasn't kosher, so now you have to do what? You know, saying like, it's like, what? It's not something that you want to do. It's like, but if you're standing in front of God, so all of a sudden you're like, well, if it comes from that place of God, then I guess I'll do it. Sorry, this is a conversation I was having the other day. But anyway, no, the idea is if, you have to have what's called a toughest dam mila. It happens to a lot of guys. When I was in yeshiva, it was like every other day. Guys were having this, that if your bris was not done correctly, you have to have someone take a little poke and draw blood. But a guy here is like, what are you talking about? I just got to yeshiva 10 minutes ago. What do you want from me, But again, it's the idea of nullifying your will beyond rationality, because the Torah says so, and you already are sold on the Torah. Therefore, this whole level, it's called stupid. Let's put it like another word that we can understand. Foolish, right? You're willing to be crazy. It doesn't make sense. By the way, we turn on to page 118. Anyone, and those 5 lucky winners who got the copies, share them. It should be at least 10 lucky winners. You have one?
Nope.
Who has?
We have a lucky winner.
All right, so if you please share it with someone who can use it.
You should have.
There should be more. Okay, Olive has one. Anyone has a copy there? I think I made more than 2. Maybe there's some in the table right there. I'm gonna look at those. Anyway, so this is what it says, that a prophet is called by the name Meshuga in the Torah. It goes very well. Right? A Navi, a prophet, he has the Torah and the description in the Torah called a crazy person. And we see it in the verses. Kamosha Kasu, Madua ba Meshuga hazeh. Right? When Shaul is prophesying and so forth, he says, why is it? Where is this crazy person coming to me? He's a prophet, mamash, a man of God, the highest thing you can reach in Olam Hazeh is become a prophet. And why is this nutcase coming over here? Right? It's a weird thing to say. Dihine, and it was not, by the way, it could not have been a pejorative term. It was not an insult. God forbid, you can't insult the prophets, right? That doesn't go well. So they called him Meshuga. It's obviously, it does not have necessarily only a negative connotation. And what's it all about is because the time when the revelation of prophecy would befall a man, he would have to, at that moment, take off his physicality. What does it mean? It doesn't mean necessarily that he would do some surgery on himself, but anything having whatsoever to do with his physical participation in the world would have to completely cease. And this looked crazy. In other words, a person, you have to sort of keep your wits about you to be just like, your sense of balance, whatever it was. If you're like living in the Gashmias Dika world, you have certain rules you have to apply into the Gashmias state. It's also crazy, for example, to let's say for Moshe Rabbeinu not to eat for 40 days and 40 nights. He went onto the mountain. Like prophets, they strip themselves from anything physical. They go out of the dimension of the rules of the Gashmias suit, the physical suit that their animal soul represents and is. So when you get at the moment of prophecy, now Moshe Rabbeinu was living in the state of the prophetic moments. He was just beyond the physicality altogether. But other prophets would receive suddenly prophecy, and at that moment they had to completely undress themselves, as it were, from any connection to physicality. V'hainu hamshatas haseichel v'amidos. And what does it mean to undress themselves from physicality? It means, well, where does physicality first put on its clothes? We just got through saying that's called the intellect and the emotions, right? Because those intellect and emotions, those are your first suit, right? Remember, the soul does not have a description, just like God does not have a description. He's beyond description. But since God wants to interact with us, and the soul, by way of analogy, wants to interact with this world, it can't come as an infinite being having no connection points with the world around it. So it has to enclose itself in parts which enable it to be communicating with this reality. So the parts are, for example, it decides to have an intellect. So the infinite soul decides, you know what, I'm going to start thinking and knowing things, contracting and confining myself into a certain boundary so that I can participate in what's going on in this realm. I'm going to have emotions so I can start participating in what's going on in this realm. Fine. So that's all a contracted part of the soul. When it prophesizes, those things are standing in the way from the true godly experience. So it has to take off its emotional experience. It has to take off its intellectual experience. What's left is just pure godliness. And that's what's sort of residing in this being of the prophet. It's very hard to look at such a person or have any connection with him because he's no longer an intellectual and emotional being. He's beyond that.
Yechida level.
He's on the Yechida level. This is the level of prophecy, basically. Yeah.
So when you say soul, are you saying the animal soul and the godly soul? Like, are they like...
I'm talking about even the godly soul at this
two
moment.
components of the same thing? They both come from the same place. In the end, they both go back to the same place. Are they always together?
No, they're not always together. No. The godly soul puts on its 10-power suit, right? The 10-spheros suit. And then that resides in the heavenly worlds in its own domain. When it wants to come into a physical world, so just like we were saying a moment ago, when the soul is like without any garments, it's just unrelatable altogether. It can't even have any relationship with anybody or anything because it doesn't have the tools of relationship. So it goes into a 10-power suit, right? But now, great, it's got intellect, it's got emotion, but it has nothing to do with physical intellect and emotion. It's still completely unable to relate to, let's say, another human being on earth because its intellect and emotion are in the realm of spiritual and godly. You can't have a conversation with that person. So it has to further enclose itself into another suit of 10 spheros, which are much more thick and coarse, and that's called the animal soul. And then the animal soul further goes into an actual physical body, which is even something other than the animal soul. It's like material, right? Which is also built in the structure that it's able to hold these 10 powers. So you've got like investiture upon investiture upon investiture. By the time your soul is in there, it's like this little driver behind this giant spaceship, you know, basically trying to communicate with the world around it, right? But it's mostly goof, it's mostly metal and screws, you know? It's just a little man in there driving the ship, right? So the idea is that when you prophesize, the man goes out of the ship, right? And the man even goes out of the man. In other words, he goes completely beyond any relatable characteristics, and so he looks crazy. The ship starts going haywire. Right? You say, here comes that Meshugana, right? Like, he's just going crazy because he's not driving that ship anymore. He's going to a place where he's just communing with the Eibishter at a level of Yechida, and it doesn't really relate to Olam Hazeh. So they called him crazy.
You like that, eh?
Yeah.
The godly soul, it's eternal because that investiture doesn't necessarily have a time when it doesn't happen. In other words, it's just that it negates its sort of, what happens is they don't disappear, they become buttle, right? So they're there in a state of potential. They can always resurface. So they are there. You understand what I'm saying? Just like the goof, by the way, is always there. It's going to come back and live forever eventually. It's just, where does it go in the meantime? It nullifies itself. Yeah? But the point is, that's an interesting topic, like, you know, where does it go and so forth. But the point is, you can see there's two states of it. It's either invested or not invested, right? And shtus to Kedusha is its non-invested state, and that's the state of prophecy, frankly. Yeah?
And this, with the seichel and the midas, is that the nefesh bahamas? This is
both, but he's primarily talking about the nefesh bahamas here, but it's also both. He goes also out of his nefesh seichel and midos of his animal soul, as godly soul as well. Absolutely.
So are we on a state of prophecy?
What's that?
Are we on a state of prophecy?
If you're a chassid of the Rebbe on Miftzoim, and you're living in a state of shtus to Kedusha, you are at some type of a prophetic type of level, because what's flowing through you is not the normal you. It's some aspect of the soul, which is the Yechida of the soul, and you can see that's why it's so miraculous what goes on with the shluchim, right? Because they're not themselves anymore. It's like this Yechida, klali, this general Yechida, which is basically the Rebbe. He's the Yechida of all mankind. He drives the ship all of a sudden. He takes over, and all of a sudden, You see miracles. You see, what's the miracle that you see? The resurrection of the dead of Am Yisrael, right? So yes, that is like a type of prophetic state. I mean, it doesn't look necessarily what you want it to look like. You can't pride yourself and pat yourself on the back. You're just standing there putting tefillin on someone. But what you're doing is bringing a light into this world, which is not an enclosed light. It's a pashut Yechida light. Yeah.
It seems kind of disrespectful to say bringing us back from the dead, because mostly to the people that were continuing fighting, the people who left the Holocaust and who started museums in the random parts of Indiana, and people who just kept fighting and did stuff. Just to say resurrection of the dead is enough.
The dead means that if you're not connected with Atem hadvekim b'Hashem Elokechim chaim kulchem hayom. It says anyone who's connected with the Lord your God, which is Torah mitzvahs, is alive. If you disconnect from Torah mitzvahs, what have we been saying? You're severing slowly that little rope, right? So are they still alive? Yes. If there's still some strand left of their faith in God, right? And they're still alive, right? But they're like on life support. They're hardly breathing. Now, is it their fault? It's not disrespectful, It's not disrespectful to a dead person also to say you're dead. You're not disrespecting anybody. You're just calling out the situation.
You're just not living.
Right? So the idea is that, listen, if the Jewish people are going to all of a sudden decide to assimilate and become goyim, Judaism is dead. You can call it what you want. You can call it making museums in India, but it's called dead, right? Museums in India is not putting on tefillin, right? Museums in India is not building the Beis HaMikdash. It's whatever it is. It's wonderful people with wonderful ideas that are not necessarily coming from the Torah Tamimi, right? So am I insulting them? Listen, it can happen to anybody, right? Especially if you went through hell. But I'm saying you can't say that it's life. It's Jewish life, right? And on the contrary, that's what they say. It's like the Rebbe's whole many times there would be a statement like, if you want to take money and give a whole heck of a lot of it to sort of like deny the Holocaust or remember the Holocaust or do something to sort of negate that experience, don't build museums remembering the Holocaust. Build yeshivas where you bring Jewish life back to life. In other words, what you're doing is you're basically making a cemetery, a memorial for the dead. He says, guess what? We didn't die. Start funneling life into life. Start funneling money into life, And this is the idea of support. It's a lot less, it's whatever. Whatever. It is what it is. But it's not disrespectful what I'm saying. It's just a cold reality of the situation. Anyway, take off your clothes. That's what it's saying. And where do we see it? Kamosha Kasu, Shaul said that Shul also took off his garments at that time and prophesied. I was joking, but I wasn't. The prophets would not only take off their physical suit and their 10-powered suit, they would literally take off their clothes. That was the minhag of prophecy. You would get naked to prophesize. He brings the pasuk here. Yushed gam hu es begadav yisnabeh. He took off his clothes, also him, and prophesied. And there was this whole story of Shaul. Once he was anointed king, right? Hashem sort of came to him and anointed him, Shmuel Hanavi, and he's like walking back from like this kind of like big raise that he got. All of a sudden he became the king of Israel, and he bumps into a band of prophets, and he says he too took off his clothes and started prophesying, right? Because prophets took off their clothes because it was a physical, symbol of something that they were doing spiritual. They were climbing out of any restrictions. They were going up into their Yechida.
Would they shave their heads too? Like shave their hair?
I do not believe they shaved their hair.
They play a musical instrument, be rich, happy.
The levushim hem baim mitzad chet eitzadas. The garments come from the sin of the chet eitzadas, of the sin of the knowledge of good and evil. Right? Where did garments come from? You trace it all the way back. Garments have a history too. Don't leave them out of it. Where did garments come from? There was no such thing as garments until Adam and Chava sinned. And all of a sudden Hashem said, where are you hiding? He said, I'm naked. He said, well here, clothing. God invented clothing. It was a response to sin. It was a response to sin. Before the sin, it says they were both naked. And they were not embarrassed. In other words, they were in a state of pure, divine Yechida. And so to speak, they weren't embarrassed. They didn't yet crawl into a state of constricting themselves into the rational, into the emotional, so to speak, into refining and confining the soul into these lower levels. So the clothing represented a flaw, right? That all of a sudden the godliness was like was diminished, and therefore could be covered over, and therefore had to be protected and guarded. It had to be covered over. Because of this sin, suddenly garments came into the world. And remember, what is this whole mimer about? Is that it was trying to bring us back to the garden, right? Basi, Legani, the very first words of the mimer, is saying that I've returned to my garden when the Beis HaMikdash was built, or when the Mishkan was built, where I was to begin with. In other words, because in the meantime, I put on all these garments, this sin, that sin, next sin, all 7 generations of sin, wound up making the godly soul very, very constricted inside of these garments. And finally, when the 7th generation came, it was able to divest itself of all these garments and bring back a state of nakedness, which is like a prophetic state of the Beis HaMikdash.
What's Nis Chadesh?
Nis Chadesh was renewed, came into existence anew. Because what really is sin? Sin is a feeling that's mixed in with good and evil. Right? The whole concept of sin is that suddenly you have a feeling of self, essentially. Right? That's where sin comes from. That you desire something, you want something for yourself. When they were in a state like a child, he's like a little tiny baby. He's like not really in a state of possible to sin, right? Because he doesn't even know that he's there, right? He's not really aware yet that he's in the room, It's like you try and teach him the word like you, You're like you. He's like you. He doesn't know what you is, It's an interesting thing.
Yeah, it is.
They don't have their own sense of self yet. And when you get your own sense of self, that's when it's relevant sin. You're going to do things for yourself. It's like beyond it. You lose that sort of state of altruism. What's that?
You can't be selfish? What are you saying?
Okay.
What are you saying?
What is he saying?
Right. You can be selfish, but that's the state of sin. Right.
Not as a child.
V'kasiv,
Right.
and it says v'yadu ki erumim heim. They knew suddenly that they were naked. What happened? They suddenly had a sense of self. Suddenly they realized, wait a second, I'm aware of myself and like I'm not dressed, right? Where a little baby does not have that experience, right? He's sort of beyond the sense of knowing whether he's dressed or he's not dressed, or whether it's important to be dressed or not important to be dressed. He doesn't realize that there could be something wrong here because he doesn't have a sense of self. So the whole idea is like really, what did sin enter into? By them it was the other way around. In other words, they were free of sin, and sin gave them the sense of self. They didn't even have a sense of self until they were tricked into sinning. But once they had the sin in them, the presence of sin in a person meant they knew they were naked. They were aware of themselves. So that's the idea of being sort of separate from God in some sense. At the level of Yechida, you're a shliach, right? You're just on a mission. There's no you're the Rebbe. And the Rebbe's connected with Hashem, and you're just one. When you disconnect yourself from that shlichus, you're back to sort of like being an entity which has to battle with your issues and so forth. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's important to make a distinction between the senses of selfishness. For example, if you're having a conversation and it's 9:50 and you're like, I need to get to bed, to break yourself away from the conversation to get to bed would be selfish. But it is also for a much better...
It's not really selfish is the point. It's not really selfish. What defines selfish is the question we're asking. What defines selfish? Selfish means you're doing something for yourself as opposed to for God. And when you're staying up late, for whatever reasons you have, even if you're going to pretend that it's for God, if it's going to ruin your entire next day, it's the trick of the Yetzer Hara, and that's selfish. Being a slave, basically, is what's called not selfish. Because you don't have any decisions of your own. You're doing something for a higher being, for your master. So any decision made for your master, it's not for yourself. So saying, I'm putting myself to bed right now, it's not for you. It could be for you. In other words, if you're in the middle of something where it truly the divine service demands you to be there at that time, so that, okay, you have to have a good understanding of what you can handle and what you can't handle. But putting yourself to bed and demanding, so to speak, that's your godly self that you're demanding for. Your godly self also has an eye. But the eye of the godly self is Hashem's eye. You're doing it for Him, not for you, not the separate animalistic eye that eye is wrapped inside of. So it still has boundaries and decisions that it has to make.
So you're making a distinction between societal and divine selfishness.
I don't know about societal even, but your I, and the divine I, which is inside of you, right? If you don't blame society, right? We're gonna hold here, but no, we just ran out of time. Shkoyach. We'll finish it tomorrow.
Rabbi, you're it.
Hey, you're it.
Oh my God. Last morning, so this
I had a thought about these.
Oh, Yachira.
I had a thought about these tapes. You know,
You're watching these videos.
how we can expand and get the people.
Watch them.
You know, you want to get as many Jews as possible, especially guys like maybe us, huh?
Right.
You put them